The world of Cyberpunk is a violent and dangerous place, filled with people who'd love to rip your arm off and eat it. The traditional concepts of good and evil are replaced by values of expediency. You do what you have to do to survive. If you can do some good along the way, great, but don't count on it. That is the very first description of the setting in the core manual for Cyberpunk 2020, the pen and paper role-playing game that Cyberpunk 2077 is built upon, and by looking at the classic RPG, we can uncover a lot of information about the world and lore of 2077. In the Cyberpunk universe, the Earth is a vastly different place to the one we know. Between 1990 and 2020, a series of wars, ecological disasters and rebellions across the globe caused many countries to become bankrupt, the world's stock market to collapse, governments to fall, and millions of lives to be wiped out. The only groups to really prosper during this time were megacorporations, and as countries fell apart, many turned to these organisations to save them, but in the process granted them more power and more control. In the end, it became the corporations that controlled most of the world, and if they couldn't buy your cooperation, their personal armies of cyborg assassins would be able to take it. This was also the case in the United States, where the power of the Senate, Supreme Court, and most other branches of the government had all but evaporated. Instead, the true power lies with state and city governments, but most of these are little more than fronts for the corporations. Over the years, a number of states have separated from the US and become known as free states. Among them was California, which also separated itself even further by splitting into two entities known as Northern and Southern California. On the border between these two states is Night City, the setting for Cyberpunk 2020 and 2077. Night City was built by Richard Knight. His dream was for it to be a new, safe and clean corporate city, free from crime and urban blight. And for a while he was successful. The early construction of the city was a beacon of light, but unfortunately his plans went awry. During the construction, he decided to use his own company's materials and techniques, and in the process excluded the established unions and construction firms. Many of these groups were controlled by organised crime syndicates, and just 4 years after the initial construction, Richard Knight was assassinated and the gangs took over. Under their rule, the city became a war zone of crime, drugs, prostitution and violence. It continued like this for a number of years, but eventually the corporations decided they'd had enough of the gangs and decided to intervene. Through a series of strikes, they eliminated the leaders and forced the gangs away from the centre of the city. Then they established a corporate-controlled city council and deputised their own security forces, giving them complete control of the city's laws and its law enforcement. The city centre and the corporate areas were restored to their pristine conditions, but the rest of the city was left to fend for itself. Any small pockets of crime in the corporate areas were kept in check by private security forces who conduct brutal sweeps and maintain constant surveillance. But the further you go from the city centre, the rougher things get. The South City, for example, is a seedy ruin of cheap housing, which spreads into an area so brutal it's known as the Combat Zone. By 2020, Night City was the quintessential city of the Cyberpunk universe. Gritty and dangerous, but also slick and stylish. It's a city where high fashion and style meld with combat and violence in the nightclubs, streets and bars. Where attitude is everything and everybody you meet is packed full of cybernetic enhancements, which can do anything from interfacing with the net to slicing off your head. The term cyberpunk refers to the fusion of cybernetic technology and punk rock attitude. And Night City is just as much the embodiment of this as any character. On a number of occasions over the decades, the mega corporations had waged war on one another. This was mainly done through sabotage, espionage and cyber attacks, but in the year 2025, the fourth corporate war involved intense battles between mercenary groups. This culminated in the destruction of downtown Night City, when a tactical nuke was detonated. This ended the war, but in the aftermath, there was widespread corruption of the net and pretty much all recorded data was lost. As a result, even recently recorded history has been thrown into doubt, as recordings and evidence of events no longer exist. For example, many people in the world now believe that Richard Nixon committed suicide on camera rather than resigning over Watergate. This war also led to the collapse of many more nations, the world economy, and a number of megacorporations. Between the events of the Fourth Corporate War and Cyberpunk 2077, many decades have passed. Presumably, downtown Night City has been rebuilt, and there are a number of story threads that could be picked up in the game. The political situation is interesting, as the city sits on the border of the two Californian states. The balance of power between corporations will also be important, as it's very possible we could have seen more corporate wars over the past decade, and perhaps even one still happening during the time of the game. The advances in technology are also likely to be dramatic. We're now 57 years on from 2020, and even then, you could have interface plugs in your wrists, weapons in your arms, lasers in your eyes, and biochips in your brain. Where things could go from there is pretty much limitless. Then there is the cyberpunk movement itself. In 2020, it was still fairly new. Cyberpunks are described as the kind of people who grabbed these technological advances by the throat and hung on. But it's also the attitude, it's the fashion, the mirrored shades, knowing the right people, and planning your crimes in the best clubs. A cyberpunk never walks when they can stride, never drives slow when they can go fast. Living on the edge was a key tenet of the cyberpunk attitude, but seeing how that matures over the decades will be fascinating. What are you most excited about in Cyberpunk 2077? Let me know in the comments below. As always, this is James from Curse, saying thanks for watching, and enjoy the game.